I always thought I had the perfect life. My husband, Arthur, was a successful businessman. Together we built his empire from scratch. He started with a small company, and I was his reliable support. I wasn't just his wife. I was his right hand. His business wouldn't have survived without me. I worked on deals, helped with finances, sorted out paperwork. When he lost hope, I got him back on his feet. When the company was on the verge of failure, I found a solution. We were a team. At least, that's what I thought. The first cracks in a perfect life. Something had changed recently. Arthur used to always call me during the day, asking how I was doing. Now his phone was always busy. He was increasingly late. He was increasingly absent. And although I didn't want to admit it, something was wrong. His changes. I noticed the little things. He used to look at me with warmth. Now his gaze had become cold. We used to have dinner together. Now he made excuses. "A lot of work, honey," he would say, without even looking at me. His phone was constantly vibrating. I couldn't help but notice that he had started to take more care of himself. New haircut, new expensive suits, new perfume. He didn't worry about such things before. I asked myself, who is he changing for? First suspicion. One night, when he was asleep, I took his phone. Before, it never had a password. Now it did. I felt my insides getting colder. Why is he hiding his phone from me? For the first time in my life, I felt scared. But I didn't know that this was the beginning of my worst nightmare. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. I couldn't sleep. My heart was beating faster than usual, as if warning me of something terrible. Arthur's phone was on the nightstand, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I knew I had no right to rummage through his personal belongings. I knew that trust was the foundation of a marriage, but I also knew that he had changed. And now I had to find out why. Sudden suspicion. The next day, I decided to check on him. He went to the shower, and I opened his laptop. I knew it was wrong, but my body moved on its own. The screen lit up, and an open email appeared in front of me. I began to scroll through my emails. Everything seemed normal until I came across an email with the subject line, "I miss you already, my love." My fingers clenched, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I clicked on the letter. It was short, but every word pierced me like a knife. Last night was unforgettable. I look forward to our next meeting. Don't make me wait too long. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted around the screen, trying to find something that would disprove it. But no, here it was all obvious. The moment that changed everything. I heard the bathroom door open behind me. Arthur came into the room, drying his hair with a towel. I slammed my laptop shut. He noticed my expression and frowned. Did something happen? His voice was calm, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know how to begin. 1,000 thoughts were racing through my head, but none of them formed a coherent sentence. "Who is she?" I finally gasped. His face darkened. "What are you talking about?" I stood up from my chair, trying to control myself. "Don't pretend you don't understand." He sighed and threw the towel on the chair. "You were going through my things?" His voice turned cold. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Are you serious? Is that all you can say?" He looked at me indifferently. "What do you want to hear?" I felt anger rising in my chest. "I want the truth." He took a step forward and crossed his arms over his chest. "Okay, really?" He tilted his head to the side and smiled a cold, emotionless smile. "You're nothing to me anymore. She's my future." Those words destroyed me. My heart seemed to stop for a second, then it started beating, so hard I felt dizzy. I knew something was wrong between us, but I wasn't ready to hear it. "You're kidding, right?" My voice faltered. He looked down at me, as if I wasn't his wife, but an extra person in his life. "You're getting old," he said slowly, "and I don't want to waste my life on a woman who drags me down." I sucked in a sharp breath, as if I'd been punched in the stomach. "I helped you build this business. So what?" His indifference cut me more sharply than any knife. "I deserve a better life," he added, picking up the phone from the table. "And me." My voice dropped to a whisper. He didn't even flinch. "You'll make it." That was the last thing he said before he left the room. I was left standing there, broken, destroyed, empty. This man to whom I had given my life, my love, my support, had just told me that he no longer needed me. And the worst part was, he didn't even hesitate. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I should have cried. I should have fallen to my knees and sobbed in pain. But instead, I slowly walked to the mirror and looked at my reflection. I was a woman who had just been destroyed. But I was also a woman who had not yet said her last word. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I couldn't remember how the days passed. I couldn't remember the last time I ate or slept properly. All I knew was one fact. My husband, the man I had dedicated my life to, had cheated on me and made no secret of it. He acted as if I no longer existed. But the worst was yet to come. Legal destruction. One day I received a subpoena. Divorce. He filed the papers first. And when I saw his demands, my hands started shaking. He was taking everything from me. Our house. He was keeping it. Our joint savings. He had already transferred them to his accounts. My contribution to his business. Legally, it didn't matter. Everything was in his name. And I got nothing. When I came to meet him and his lawyers, I hoped he would show at least a drop of humanity. But his face was as cold as the day he told me I was nothing to him. That's not fair, I said, holding the documents in my hands. He shrugged. It's business. I felt everything boil inside me. It was my business, too. His lawyer cleared his throat quietly, and Arthur himself looked at me mockingly. Really? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I've worked with you since day one. He crossed his arms. But legally you were never a part of it. My fingers tightened around the sheet of paper I held in my hands. Isn't that enough for you? You've already taken everything. His lips stretched into a crooked smile. Don't worry, I left you something. I gritted my teeth. So what? He leaned back in his chair. Memories. The words pierced me like a knife into my heart. He knew those words would hurt the most. He knew I couldn't just erase all the years we'd spent together from my life. And he was enjoying it. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back my tears. How can you be so cruel? He pretended to think. Well, I just don't want to care about a woman who has nothing of her own anymore. I felt a lump form in my throat. I never had any money of my own because we worked together. He nodded. So you don't get used to living without it. The final blow. After the court hearing, I stood outside the building and watched him get into his expensive car. She was sitting next to him, his new girlfriend. Young, beautiful, self-confident. She smiled at me as if to say, now he's mine. And he didn't even look in my direction. The car drove away smoothly. I stood there, wearing a cheap coat that was the only thing left of my past life. And I understood. He didn't just throw me out of his house. He threw me out of my own life. I was left with nothing. No home. No money. No job. The woman he left behind. I didn't know how to get through this day. I wandered the streets, trying to find an answer to the question. What now? But there was no answer. I arrived at my friend's apartment, where I had temporarily stayed after the divorce. I sat on the couch, pulled my phone out of my old bag, and opened the banking app. I had a few pennies left in my account. All I could afford was coffee for a few days. Before, we could go anywhere in the world, live in luxury hotels. Now I didn't even know where I would be living in a week. I no longer existed in his world. But I hadn't said my last word yet. I could sit here and sob. I could allow myself to break down, to turn into a miserable woman cursing her fate. But I didn't want to. I remembered my own words. I've worked with you since day one. And I realized the most important thing. I knew this business better than he did. I knew all its connections, all its weaknesses. I knew how everything worked. And if Arthur thought that I would forever remain the woman he had thrown to the sidelines of life, he was bitterly mistaken. This is not the end. This is just the beginning of my game. I knew that after this divorce, my old reality was gone. No more expensive restaurants, no more international travel, no more designer clothes. I didn't even have a home of my own. I was living in a friend's apartment, trying to figure out how to move on. Every morning I woke up with a squeezing pain in my chest. But with each passing day, that pain began to turn into something else. Rage. A desire for revenge. And before that happened, I had to become stronger. The fight for survival. My life had seemed easy before. I was part of a successful business, working alongside my husband. Now I had to start all over again. I started looking for work, but quickly realized nobody expected me. I had no documentary proof that I was part of Arthur's company. All contracts, all important agreements were drawn up in his name. I was a nobody. I tried to find at least some kind of vacancy, but at best I was offered the position of administrator or office manager. My skills and knowledge turned out to be useless to anyone. But I knew one thing. I knew how his business worked. I knew all the processes, all the weak points. I knew how he made decisions and what mistakes he made. And it was this information that could change everything. The first opportunity. One evening, when I was once again flipping through vacancies on my phone, a friend said, "What if you try to find a job in the same field?" I thought about it. Work in the same industry where Arthur worked? It meant being close to his business. It meant having access to information that I might need. I took a breath and started looking for a different strategy. I was no longer looking at entry-level jobs. I was looking for access to a real business. And then I saw the ad. One of the companies that Arthur had once partnered with was looking for a manager in the finance department. I knew the business. I knew they didn't like Arthur because he always acted arrogantly. And I knew I had a chance. My first return to business. I came to the interview in a simple suit. There were no more branded things. I couldn't afford to look like I used to. But I was confident in myself. When I sat down in front of the head of the company, he looked at me carefully. "You were Arthur's wife, right?" I didn't flinch. I wasn't just his wife. I worked on his business as much as he did. He raised an eyebrow skeptically. "It's strange that this isn't mentioned anywhere." I clenched my jaw. Because everything was designed for him. But I know all the internal processes of his company. I know its financial structure, its weaknesses, its problems. The manager leaned forward, interested. "So you can tell us what's going on in his business?" I nodded. "Not just tell. I can help you use it to your advantage." His face became interested. "I like your approach." A week later, I was working for a new company. And now I had a weapon. I knew Arthur's business was starting to falter. His new girlfriend was spending money like water. He wasn't a talented manager himself. He just took advantage of me helping him run everything. And now his company was starting to lose ground. And I knew my chance was coming. The first steps to revenge. I watched. I analyzed. I waited. And then I heard the news. Arthur's business was facing serious financial problems. And now his company needed an investor. This was the moment I had been waiting for. If everything went as I planned, I wouldn't just get through this ordeal. I wouldn't just get back on my feet. I would take everything from him. It would be the perfect revenge. I sat in my new office, reviewing reports and analytics. Now I worked for a company that had once been one of Arthur's key partners, and I had access to all the information I needed. I knew Arthur's business was falling apart. Before, when I was around, I helped fix his mistakes. Now no one did. He thought he was a genius, that he could run the business on his own. But the truth was different. He had always relied on me, and now his company was slowly collapsing. I was just waiting for the right moment. His new girlfriend is another problem. I found out that Arthur was officially married. He married the same young girl for whom he had left me. I had seen her photos in business magazines, always smiling, wearing expensive designer clothes. And I knew she wasn't just his wife. She was his biggest problem. She loved money. She loved fancy dinners, jewelry, private jet travel. And she knew no bounds. I had access to his company's financial statements. Over the past few months, his expenses had skyrocketed. Expensive gifts, yachts, designer clothes, all financed from corporate accounts. I smiled. His new wife was exactly what I needed. She was accelerating his downfall, losing the trust of partners. One of my new colleagues asked me over lunch, "You worked with Arthur, right? What do you think of his company now?" I took a sip of my coffee and answered as calmly as I could. "I think he's making serious mistakes. For example," I put down my cup and smiled. "He changed his management style. He was always a good manipulator, but he was never a strategist." My colleague leaned closer. "To be honest, many people are now thinking about getting out of his projects." "Why?" "He spends too much. His wife is constantly throwing expensive parties, buying houses, jewelry." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. Arthur is losing control. And that was exactly what I needed. The beginning of the big game. I knew that if I wanted to completely destroy his business, I had to act carefully. I couldn't just attack him. I had to undermine his trust from the inside. I started working with investors who were considering investing in his business. At every meeting, I carefully raised the issue of his instability. He makes very risky decisions. I would advise you to take a closer look at his financial statements. His new wife has a big impact on his spending. I didn't say it directly. I just hinted, but that was enough. Investors began to hesitate, and I knew that soon Arthur would find himself in real trouble. He's digging his own hole. One day, while sitting in the office, I received a message from an acquaintance. Have you heard the news? Arthur is looking for investors. He's in serious trouble. I leaned back in my chair. His company was on the verge of a crisis. He had lost some of his clients. His wife continued to spend money without thinking about the consequences. He was in despair. And that's when I decided to take the next step. I met with one of the potential investors and said, "If you want to invest in this business, you should think about changing the management." He leaned forward. "Do you have any suggestions?" I smiled. "Yes. I knew this business would soon be mine. I knew he would make me its owner. And when that happens, I will destroy him completely." I watched Arthur's business collapse before his eyes. His new wife continued to squander money. His partners turned away from him, and investors hesitated to invest in a company that was spiraling into ruin. I was waiting for the perfect moment, and that moment came sooner than I expected. Financial crisis. One day during lunch, a colleague of mine casually said, "Did you hear that Arthur lost another big client?" I looked up from my cup of coffee. "Oh, really?" "Yes, they said they no longer trusted him. His finances are a complete mess." I could barely hold back a smile. Arthur couldn't run the company without me. I was the one who handled the contracts, the one who dealt with the crises. And now he was on his own. And he was ruining everything with his own hands. His panic. A few days later, I heard another piece of news from my friends. Arthur was looking for an investor who could save his company. That meant only one thing. He had officially admitted that he was losing everything. His pride no longer mattered. He needed money. And that was where I made my move. Negotiations. I met with one of the big investors who was hesitant about investing in Arthur's business. "I'm considering his company, but there are risks," he said as we sat in a private office in a restaurant. I nodded. "The risks are huge. What do you think will happen to his company in a year?" I paused and slowly replied, "If he stays as CEO, the company will collapse." He thought about it. "Then the question remains, who can run this business better?" I looked him straight in the eye and answered without hesitation. "Me." There was silence. "You?" "Yes." I explained to him that I knew this business better than Arthur himself. I created it from scratch. I built its reputation. If you invest the money but put Arthur in charge, you will simply lose everything. And if we put you in charge, I smiled, then you will make a profit. He thought for a moment, and then he said, "I like your style." The final steps. Investors began to negotiate to buy Arthur's company. He didn't yet know who was behind it. He was too busy saving his marriage. His wife didn't look so happy anymore. She was tired of the money disappearing. She wanted a luxurious life, not debt. And just when the situation for Arthur became critical, I made my final move. I become his new owner. A few days later, the investors announced, "Arthur's company will be sold, but the name of the new owner has not yet been disclosed." I imagined Arthur nervously looking through the documents, trying to understand who was buying him. He thought it was one of the big players in the market, but he had no idea it was me. And when he finds out the truth, it will be the sweetest moment of my life. I knew this day would come. I knew that sooner or later he would lose everything. But I never imagined it would happen so quickly. His last hope. Arthur didn't yet know who was buying his company, but he knew he had no choice. He had met with bankers, investors, tried to convince someone to invest, but everyone turned him down. His reputation was ruined. He even turned to his wife. "We need to tighten our belts," he told her one evening. She only raised an eyebrow. "Are you kidding?" "We'll temporarily cut costs, and then everything will be fine." Her gaze turned cold. I didn't subscribe to that. "These are just temporary difficulties." She took her phone, opened Instagram, and said emotionlessly, "I'm not going to be a bankrupt's wife. His wife is leaving him. She packed her things that same evening. He tried to stop her. Honey, don't be stupid. I did everything for you. She didn't even look at him. Do you know what your problem is, Arthur? He clenched his fists. What? She zipped up her suitcase and looked up at him coldly. You thought I loved you. He froze. What? She sighed, as if she was too lazy to even explain. You were just a wallet to me. You stopped being rich. You stopped being interesting to me. He took a step towards her, but she raised her hand. No need for a scene. I've already found someone more promising. And with those words she walked out the door, leaving him all alone. His world had collapsed. He was left without a wife, without friends, without money. His accounts were frozen. His real estate was mortgaged. His cars were sold to pay off his debts. And most importantly, his company no longer belonged to him. But he still didn't know who had bought it. And that was what I was waiting for the most. The last meeting. The next day, he came to the final meeting, where the new owner was to be officially announced. I was sitting at a large table in the conference room. I still hadn't been announced. Arthur looked devastated. I could see that he hadn't slept for several nights. He was desperately hoping that the new owner would leave him something. His hands were shaking as he drank the water. He didn't know what was in store for him. His worst fear. The head lawyer stood up and said, Thank you all for being here. Today we are officially handing over the company to its new owner. Arthur stared at him intently. I could barely contain my smile. The lawyer continued, We present to you the new owner. He paused, then said, Sophia. The room fell dead silent. I slowly stood up. Arthur froze. His face was deathly pale. He looked at me as if he had seen a ghost. This is impossible. His voice trembled. I looked at him calmly and said, Hello, Arthur. His humiliation. He grabbed the documents as if he hoped they were a joke. This is some kind of mistake. The lawyer replied seriously. No, it's official. Your company belongs to her. He looked up at me in horror. Is this your revenge? I raised an eyebrow. Oh no. This is business. His eyes filled with panic. But, he tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I took a few steps towards him and delivered the final blow. Remember when you told me I was nobody? He didn't answer. Remember when you said I had no money of my own? He lowered his head. I leaned closer and whispered, And now you have nothing. The end of his story. Arthur left the room, devastated. I watched as he, the same man who had once humiliated me, now looked as if he had been thrown out into the street. He was truly left with nothing. I saw him sit on a bench outside the building, cover his face with his hands, and just sit there, not knowing what to do next. And I knew. He had lost. I had won. I watched Arthur, sitting on a bench outside the building where he had just lost everything. He was no longer the confident man who had once humiliated me. He was devastated, his shoulders slumped, his gaze vacant, his hands shaking with shock. But that was only the beginning of his humiliation. He hadn't yet realized the full implications. The last hope. A few minutes later, he raised his head sharply, as if he had suddenly realized something important. I knew that look on his face. He was looking for a way out. He didn't want to believe that he had lost. He was used to being the one in charge, the one in control. And now he was trying to figure out how to fix everything. I saw him grab the phone and start calling someone. He was probably calling his former partners. He didn't yet understand that no one would come to his aid. The closed door. The next day I got a message from my secretary. Arthur has come to the main office. He insists on a meeting. I smiled. I had been waiting for this moment. I told her, invite him to the conference room. But let him wait 20 minutes. I wanted him to feel that he was no longer in control. When I entered the room, he was already sitting there, nervously wringing his hands. When he saw me, anger flashed in his eyes. This was all your plan, wasn't it? I slowly walked over to the table and sat down opposite him. What exactly? All of this. The fact that you worked for a competing company. The fact that you convinced investors to buy my company. I nodded. Yes. He clenched his fists. Was that your revenge? I crossed my arms. No, Arthur. It was business. I could see his jaw clench. He hated hearing his own words spoken against him. You can't just throw me out of the company. I raised an eyebrow. I own it now. He exhaled, trying to control his anger. Okay, let's be serious. I pretended to be interested. I'm listening. Give me the position. I blinked. What an interesting twist. I know this company better than anyone. I founded it. I leaned forward and said the most painful thing to him. You lost it. His hands balled into fists. That's unfair. Unfair. I leaned back in my chair. Are you serious? He was silent. Let's remember how you left me with nothing. He looked away. I continued. Do you remember your words? You never had your own money, so you can't get used to living without it. His face flared with anger and humiliation. I slowly stood up and approached him. And now you have nothing. His eyes were filled with impotent anger. I can be useful to the company. He tried to restrain himself. You? I smiled mockingly. With what? I can help. I leaned closer and whispered. No one needs you here. He clenched his fists, but could not say anything. He destroyed me. And now I did the same to him. The end of his career. The next day I signed the order. Arthur was officially fired from the company. He no longer existed in this field. He became a nobody. His connections no longer worked. His money was gone. And most importantly, now he knew. I won. After I signed his release, Arthur disappeared. I hadn't seen him for weeks, but I knew he was out there, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. He was used to being in control. He was used to people respecting him, to him having power. And now he was a nobody. And I knew he wouldn't last long before he made one last attempt to save himself. The first messages. One evening I opened my phone and saw his name in my inbox. Sophia, let's talk. I smiled. A few minutes later, another message. I know you're mad at me, but give me a chance to explain everything. I didn't answer. I waited for him to get to the real request. And I was right. I'm in trouble, Sophia. I need your help. Here it is. I hung up the phone without answering. I wanted him to wait, for him to feel the same humiliation I felt after the divorce. The unexpected visit. A few days later, I was returning home late at night. When I reached the entrance to the house, I saw him. Arthur was standing by the door, looking nothing like I remembered. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His eyes were tired and empty. He had lost all his shine. I stopped and crossed my arms. What are you doing here? He took a step toward me, but I didn't back down. Sophie, please. His voice was quiet, broken. I stared into his face, trying to see in him the confident man I once knew. He was gone. We have nothing to talk about, I said coldly. He swallowed nervously. I know I made a mistake. I smiled. What kind of mistake? He was silent. Abandoned me for someone else? Took everything. Humiliated me. He lowered his head. I thought you would break. I took a step forward, but I didn't break. He raised his head, and I saw despair in his eyes. Give me a chance. I raised an eyebrow mockingly. For what? I'm ready to start over. I can work. I laughed. Do you want me to hire you? His jaw tightened. He knew it sounded pathetic. I know this company. I stopped in front of the door and turned to him. You forgot one detail. He tensed up again. What detail? I slowly said each word. You have no place here. His face turned white. He understood that this was final. He could no longer manipulate me. He no longer had power. I walked past him, opened the door, and before entering said, Now you are alone, just like I was after the divorce. And with these words I closed the door in his face. His final humiliation. The next morning I opened the news. One of the journalists wrote an article. Former businessman Artur lost everything. His wife, his business, and his money. What went wrong? I carefully looked at the photo taken by the paparazzi. He sat on a park bench, alone, staring blankly at me. He was no longer the man he had imagined himself to be. I put down the phone and looked up. The sun was shining brightly. I knew today was a new day. And unlike him, I never looked back. I was sitting in my new office. Huge panoramic windows opened up a view of the city that I could now call my own. This office had once belonged to him. Now it was my place. I leaned back in my chair, holding a cup of coffee in my hands. I could allow myself to relax. I had achieved what seemed impossible. I had not only survived divorce and betrayal. I had risen from the lowest point of my life and reached the top. And now I was on the side where he used to be. And he is now where I used to be. Echoes of the past. I picked up the phone again and looked at the news feed. All the business publications wrote about me. The main sensation of the year, a woman who was left with nothing by her ex-husband, now owns his company. Arthur is bankrupt, his wife has left him, and his ex-wife now controls everything that once belonged to him. Fate strikes back. The man who thought he had everything is now left with nothing. I stared at these headlines, and something inside me finally let go. I no longer felt anger. I no longer felt hatred. There was only satisfaction. I had finally proven to myself. I was never weak. I was never the one to lose. I was the one to win. The last meeting. I was about to go home when the secretary knocked on the door. "We have an unexpected visitor." I raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She shrugged. "He's not listed, but he's your ex-husband." I held my breath for a second. I knew it would happen sooner or later. He couldn't just disappear. He needed to see me again. I nodded slowly. "Let him in." A few minutes later, the door opened and he walked in. I barely recognized him. His suit, once perfect, now looked wrinkled. His face, always well-groomed, now showed signs of sleep deprivation and stress. His eyes no longer shone with confidence. He looked broken. He sat down across from me, silent. The room was silent for a few seconds. You really did it," he finally said, looking me in the eye. His voice was low, as if he still couldn't believe what had happened. I answered calmly, "Yes." He sighed nervously and looked away. "I didn't expect this from you." I smiled. "Because you never knew me." His fingers trembled and he clutched his head. "I made mistakes, Sophia." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "Really? And what kind of mistakes?" He looked up at me, his eyes full of pity. "That's all." I paused. "It doesn't matter anymore." He lowered his head. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it. Before, yes. I wanted to see him humiliated, destroyed. I wanted him to feel the same pain I felt. But now I was above that. "No, Arthur. I just forgot you." His face twisted in pain. To him, those were the worst words. Because hate means you still feel. And forgetting means a person has ceased to exist. He stood up, sighing heavily. "So what now?" I slowly stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Now you're leaving." He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then he just nodded. And left. Forever. A new reality. I stood by the window, watching him disappear into the crowd. He had once been the center of my world. But more than that, he was just a memory. I turned around, picked up my bag, and left the office. A new life awaited me. And this time it was mine alone.